Welcome, everybody, to this very interesting, exciting session. It's terrific. How many Londoners in the audience? There you go. So there are no doubt you're here to hear your ex-mayor. How many people in the audience have lived in Delhi? Pretty sizable. I'll add mine to both of those. So we have authors of two terrific books on London. Ken Livingstone's very new book, Livingstone's London, which is available for sale outside, and you'll sign copies, which is out officially next week. Yeah. So you're getting a preview sale here. And Rana Dasgupta's book, Capital, on Delhi, which came out 5 years ago. Yep. And how many of you have read Rana Dasgupta's Capital? Excellent. So that's a better showing than I had expected, because it's a tough book to read, but not because it's badly written, but it's a serious book. It's a serious analytical take on Delhi, which I personally enjoyed very much. It's a city I personally happen to know both Delhi and London intimately. I count myself as much a Delhite as a Londoner. And we are going to use the lens of these two cities to talk about where cities like these, capital cities, big megalopolis, feature in the global imagination, what happens with flows of money and people and ideas and culture through these big cities like Delhi and London. So we would like, in our discussion, to bring in other great ancient, new, and other global cities as well. So I'm going to start by asking Ken, you are a quintessential Londoner. What makes you a Londoner?
Well, if I think back to the London I was born in 1945, it's been totally transformed. But then if you go back 75, 80 years before I was born, it was dramatically different as well. And I think if you go back to the very beginning, when the Romans conquered most of what we now think of as England, they established London as the base at which the armies came through, trade came through. So even almost 2,000 years ago, we were the sort of open city, too grand to call it a city in those days, through which everything came. And literally, I've listed in the book some of the times in that first 1,000 years when we were invaded by foreigners and virtually everybody in London was slaughtered, or the whole city was burnt down. And there's nothing unique about this. We're the most violent animal in the history of our planet, and all across the world, butchery and horrors like that have taken place. But I think what transformed London and Britain was just over 200 years ago, we became the first nation to start industry. Looking back on it, very primitive compared with what we see today. But it gave Britain a tremendous boost, so that rapidly we saw to being the most powerful nation on the face of the planet, controlling, after invading large parts of Africa and India and all around the world, the largest colony in human history, and the greatest amount of wealth, dwarfing anything in the United States of America or China or India. It was all very brutal. I have to say, we were ripping off the whole planet. And it was all sort of coming through London. And it led to London having a population greater than the 4 other largest cities on Earth. And it was only by the end of the 1800s that other nations started to catch up and eventually, like America, overtake. So literally, London has always been this sort of city through which everyone comes and goes and so on. But I think what strikes me, if I look back to the city I grew up in, the diversity was minimal compared to what we have now. I mean, I was brought up in Streatham at the south of Lambeth. And I can remember at about the age of 3, my grandma saying, look, across the road, a black man. I'd never seen one before. And if I think when I started school, my secondary school in 1956. That first wave of immigrants from the Caribbean had left their children at home. So although I was going to a school with 2,000 children just south of Brixton, the first black kids only arrived just as I was leaving. And the only time I ever spoke to a black person was when I bought a ticket on the bus. It was only when I started work in 1962 at the Royal Marsden Hospital's Cancer Unit, and there were 3 Ghanaians working there, and that was the first time I developed a friendship with someone who wasn't basically just British. Now you look at this city, it's stunning. I mean, my 2 teenage kids, they come back from school with their friends, and it's like a delegation from the United Nations. And I live in Brent, which has the highest rate of children born to mothers from another country, 70%, just over 70%. And it isn't just that we had that wave of migrants in the Caribbean, but people have come from all over the world. And what I find remarkable, however, is those kids are growing up like Londoners. Their faith, their race, is largely irrelevant. They're developing all the same good and bad habits that my own kids have had and my generation has. So I think this is a city that transforms people. And one of the things I was very proud of back in the days when I was mayor, there was an opinion poll. It was done just after Israel had invaded the Lebanon, which led to a surge of anti-Semitic incidents all over the Western world and elsewhere. And that poll, which was done European-wide, showed that about 9% of people in Britain had some degree of anti-Semitism. In France, it was 43%. And if I look now around this city, people of different racial backgrounds, different faiths, getting married, having kids, and it just isn't an issue or a problem. I think what makes me proud of London is we've become the most tolerant and inclusive city on the face of this planet. There are many parts of the world where someone marrying outside of their own faith is excluded from their family, or in some cases stoned to death. We have set a tremendous benefit. But also because of that legacy of our industrial base, the city I grew up in for the 30 years after I was born was a city in which everything got better. I was born into a flat that didn't have a bathroom. My parents, after 5 years, got a nice London council flat which had not just a bathroom, but a bedroom each for me and my sister. And I remember my parents arriving saying, we'll stay here till we die, it's so amazing. And literally, if you were growing up in this city, if you couldn't afford to buy your own home, we were building tens of thousands of homes for people to rent. The housing crisis was coming down. When I was chair of housing in Camden in 1978, we were building in the smallest borough in London 2,000 new homes. And we could see that by the end of 1990, we would have cleared our waiting list. Of course, Thatcher then came to power and stopped council house building, and now we've seen a nightmare. Also, when I left school, only in those days, only 4% of kids went to university, and amongst the working class, only 1%. But every kid left and got a job. And it was, you just grew up happy and confident, seeing everything get better. I think the legacy of Thatcher and Blair has damaged that. We're now seeing, I see more people sleeping on the street than at any time in my life. More people begging with their little pots than at any time in my life. And so I think there's a need now for a generation of politicians to tackle all of that and start to create the sort of London that I grew up in, one in which everything got better. I better stop now. You look like I've gone on too long.
No, not at all. We'll come back to some of these themes of class and poverty as we go along. But let me ask Rana, on your book, the blurb at the back says that you hadn't intended to live in Delhi. You had gone for a brief visit, but just stayed on. What made you stay on in Delhi?
Can I not talk about that? I'll bring it in later. Can I respond to what Ken was saying? Because I think I want to come come to Delhi via that, because I think that this this moment that you're talking about is also a very exceptional moment. The post-war moment is very, very different from the current moment. The economy is growing at, what is it, 6% or something like that for most of the 50s and 60s. And I think when you have, first of all, Britain and then America, who are the hegemonic powers within global capitalism from the 18th century onwards. And so it's not at some level very surprising that those two countries succeed in certain social technologies that allow lots of different kinds of people to get on with each other. I'm sure we would have seen the same in Rome during the Roman Empire, that people from lots of different backgrounds, that's the whole point of being an imperial center, that you know how to compensate for tribal loyalties and hatreds and all those sorts of things, and make sure that. So we shouldn't be too surprised that London has achieved this in ways that other cities haven't. That the US has also achieved certain things in the same regard. But I think that the moment we're in now should give us pause about this story of unending progress, because with the change, the sort of reversal of the economic situation comes also a reversal of several other situations. I think that to a great extent, those people who were lucky enough to become adults in the 60s and 70s, many of the diversity and open-mindedness of that era was possible partly because everybody defined themselves through economic growth. The fact that they themselves had a stake in the economy was doing things for them. Today, I think, with the economy blatantly not serving a large amount of the population, there are various other kinds of things that people are defining themselves against and around. And so issues of race and religion and things like this come back into the story in ways that are possibly a deviation from that post-war story. And I think that, London, to come to Delhi, I think it's interesting. So I went to Delhi to just for a short amount of time, and I stayed there for 17 years. And it was an extremely exciting point in the life cycle of that city. I think as everyone in the room would probably be aware, the Indian economy was liberalized or globalized in 1991. It was deregulated, and a lot of the socialist institutions were dismantled. And during the course of the 1990s, you saw a lot of kind of behind-the-scenes reforms, which really exploded into the urban landscape around the time that I arrived there in 2000, and so there was this. This was just after Clinton's visit to India, when there was this sort of euphoria about Indian entrepreneurs and business. Clinton ended a sort of long enmity between the US and India, embraced the new tech companies, which were having a very significant effect on US-India relations and things like this. And there was this expectation that India was on its way to becoming the United States. Journalists from the New York Times got euphoric about new coffee bars and young people on dates with laptops and mobile phones and things like this. And it was assumed that the historical destiny of all countries that were liberalized in this way was to become American-style societies. And what I discovered when I went there was that we were actually living in a city. I was living in a city, Delhi, that had structural resemblances far more to Moscow than it did to New York or to Washington, D.C. It was run by a very powerful set of business interests that were very close to political interests, who in a series of sort of backroom deals were making the major decisions about economic investment, development, and all these sorts of things. And the people who worked in advertising agencies or whatever, who were making significant salaries, felt themselves to be very politically disenfranchised. And I think to try and bring these two strands together, when one thinks about these different places, there's no escaping history. One has to understand that the formation of London is an extremely unique thing in world history. There is no country can replicate Britain in 1870 with the kind of global reach that Ken was talking about. And it was on the basis of that enormous global spread that British elites could give significant concessions to British working classes, such that robust institutions and legal rights and all these kinds of things were amassed in a tiny little area on the basis of an absolutely massive global machine. It wasn't that Britain as a global machine was democratic, liberal, and all those sorts of things. British people enjoyed access to those institutions and those political rights on the basis of an illiberal and undemocratic global system. It's obviously unfeasible that all the countries that emerged from colonialism in the 20th century would replicate the experience of these absolutely unique countries, Britain and America, for instance. So our instinct to constantly compare everything to those superpowers, former and current, doesn't work. And so the city I wrote about in Capital, I felt was actually, in many ways, a much better guide to the 21st century than these rather unique places. And I think, as we get to this point, I'll also shut up right now, but as we get to this point where, for the first time in 200 years, with American power waning, we look at capitalism entering a moment where it has no global policeman, no single currency, no vast patron. I mean, both Britain and America, at the peak of their global dominance, controlled about 50% of global commerce. And as we enter the new phase, where we're likely to have these sort of regional imperial powers, Russia, Iran, the US, etc., China, of course, it could be a much more unstable phase in global economic experience. And I think that will really filter back also into the urban experience of places as diverse as London and Delhi.
In fact, the title of your book, Capital, is a very good pun, really, on being the capital of a country, but also the sheer financial capital that's flowing through the city in completely opaque passages that nobody knows, where your characters in your book talk about investments of several crore billions and in vast sums of money that are unrealistic, that is going to be invested in property, in land, in infrastructure. And these are characters that you bring to life, but they are people who are believable, but they clearly inhabit a world that is cloud cuckoo land at one level, because it's aspirational, right? They want to make money, they want to have a certain lifestyle, and that's what you were describing. Now, you mentioned the US and all of this, and it would be, we're having this discussion hours after President Trump's tweet about the mayor of London, which some of you will have seen. It is, it's symptomatic, it seems to me, of trying to control a discourse that frankly is beyond the control of even the US president. He can get personal, he can pick on the mayor's Muslim identity, but really what is happening is what is controlling London's status as the financial capital of the relationships between the two countries is beyond national politics. So he can pick on the London mayor, but that's because he can tweet about it and write about it, but he's not really able to critique London as a city. That seems to me one way to read it. If you were mayor of London today, what would Trump criticize you for? Well, as you're not Muslim.
He would have denounced me as a communist, I imagine. But then, actually, On the day I became the leader of the Greater London Council back in 1981, Margaret Thatcher, who'd only been Prime Minister 2 years, made a speech saying my plan was to impose on Britain a communist tyranny like those of Eastern Europe. Now, the idea of cutting the bus and tube fares was going to trigger a commie revolution was a bit bonkers. But anyone who comes from the left and is committed to redistributing wealth from the super rich and the giant corporations gets demonised. I mean, President Roosevelt back in 1933 introduced benefits for the unemployed. The Republican press was screaming, this is the first step towards communism. Or you look at Bernie Sanders when he was running for the Democrat nomination for the presidency back in 2016, he was demonised in exactly the same way. And I think the large part of I said that 30 years I was growing up in, everything got better. This last 40 years, it certainly hasn't. Almost all the wealth created in this country in the last decade has gone to the top 1%. Ordinary people are seeing their wages either frozen in real terms or actually diminished. And if you look, I think the great banking crisis and the Great Depression in the 1930s led to countries introducing proper controls and regulations. Roosevelt passed into law the Glass-Steagall Act that regulated the banking system. We did it here with all regulations. Then in 1986, Thatcher took most of those away. In 1998, Clinton abolished the Glass-Steagall Act. And of course, come 2008, we have another huge banking crisis. But the people running our banks are still being paid millions of pounds for their jobs. They're still getting huge bonuses. The then Brown's government and the subsequent Cameron one created £350 billion of new money to prop up the banking system. Well, I think if we can do that for the bankers, why can't we actually invest in creating decent homes and jobs and a fairer society for all of us? The simple fact is, I remember Tory governments when I was growing up, Harold Macmillan's Tory government in the early 1960s, the top rate of tax on the rich was 98%. Now it's 40%. The Republican President Eisenhower in the 1950s, top rate of tax in America, 90%. And we were told by Thatcher and Reagan, reducing taxes on the rich, smashing the trade unions, cutting public spending will make a better and stronger economy. Well, it hasn't, actually. Our economies have not done as well under all of this than they did in that post-war period. And we need to win that argument and just start telling the truth because we're now moving into a genuine global economy. It's never going to be like the one I grew up in, where most of what was happening was contained within a nation. The great internet and tech firms, the richest firms in human history now, and almost paying no bloody tax. They launder all their money all over the place, which is why Bernie Sanders was subject to a desperate attempt to stop him becoming president, and Jeremy Corbyn gets the same thing here, because any politician who says we're going to stop all this tax dodging and use that money to build homes, employ more teachers, more doctors, more nurses, just gets denounced as a commie.
Yeah. In fact, the bit that links what both of you were saying, of course, is Britain's experiment with the welfare state, right? Which is an innovation, which is what causes the baby boomer generation to do so well. It raises standards, and I have to say this, that it comes out of ideas in the institution that I work with in the London School of Economics. It was the Beveridge report that thought about these issues of unemployment, health, education, housing, and so on, which continue to remain the planks on which this politics revolves around. Now, the risk of asking you a question, Rana, which you will ignore, I am going to still bravely ask you another question and see if we can just talk a little bit about people. Because again, that is so germane to the history of cities, but also to the histories of the nations. Theresa May, I think, famously called people like the ones in this room citizens of nowhere. The fact that you're interested in ideas and want to hear about other places and presumably travel across the world and don't have any solid atavistic loyalties. But the idea of migration and people coming to shape a city. We've, with London, this is a history that you bring out beautifully in your book. There is, in your account, Rana, a real link between that story of partition, the people it brings into Delhi, the sort of immediate post-colonial legacy, and its link to violence and crime. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because again, crime and crime rates in London is on the top of all our minds who live in this city at the moment. What kind of people, what causes those kinds of urban crime that we see in Delhi? The famous, of course, being around women's safety and the Nirbhaya case.
You've emotionally blackmailed me now, so I can't ignore your question.
Excellent. In front of a lot of people,
yeah.
too. Yeah, so.
Yes, so I think one of the things that this book, Capital, was faced with was the feeling that on the one hand, because of globalization, everywhere is essentially the same. That is to say that the value of money or the energy of value of money replaces other energies as the social drivers. And a lot of the story of this book is the way in which lots of pre-existing values and institutions and things like this are realigned such that money can basically drive lifestyles, desires, ideas of the good life and all those kinds of things. But the opposite is also true, that capitalism is weirdly different from one place to another because of the cultures and prehistories of the people who are entering into it. And that may actually be different even between cities, not only between countries. And in this book, I looked deeply, because the Delhi entrepreneurial class is very local. It's very, very much the Punjabi migrant families who amassed a lot of capital over the last several decades and were very well placed socially, politically, and economically to invest in the new businesses that came up after the 1990s. But that group of people had a very, very specific history. They were very largely the children and grandchildren of the people who'd come to Delhi during and after the partition of 1947. They arrived in a very specific state. They had a very shared experience. They were traumatized by the immense horrors that they'd seen during that episode. They had lost family members, they had lost businesses, they had lost locations. They had witnessed murder, rape, and mutilation on a large scale. And when they arrived in Delhi, they developed a kind of post-traumatic culture. They were part of a very grand and ancient North Indian syncretic culture of Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus. They were largely multilingual. Poetry and music was extremely important to that culture. And most of those things were rejected by those people when they arrived in Delhi and other cities. Security became the overwhelming preoccupation of those people, which was about physical security, but also about financial security. They kept their heads down, they worked very hard, they built businesses, and they took care of their kin. And the memories of that violence are still very fresh for those people. You'll remember that in 1984 there was a fresh wave of riots during which several thousand Sikhs were massacred in Delhi and many more fled and were intimidated. And so the idea that partition was a unique event that came out of the British Empire was dashed. In fact, it was an energy internal to the city and internal to these communities. And so the drive for money and business success, in many ways, I think in Delhi, is extremely different from those same drives, let's say, in California. The people who are very successful in business, whether at all levels, whether building a shop or a multi-billion-dollar business, they don't have a sense of themselves as civilians. They have a sense of themselves as warriors, and they are executing war through business. And so it's a very different culture from business elsewhere, and it does have implications for things like gender relations. Delhi is sort of famous for its gender violence, and as I talk about in detail in the book, this has not been improved by wealth. In fact, it's been exacerbated, partly because, at least within elites, women have had new opportunities of financial independence through business, and that has dramatically destabilized traditional gender relations, and there's been a lot of revenge, desires for revenge within marriages, within the city, on the part of many men.
Yeah, no, that's a very persuasive argument. I think that comes through in your book. And in London, of course, the factors behind violence and crime are so different, aren't they? And you must tell us about police numbers and how much of it the mayor does control, and if Trump is right to blame Sadiq Khan.
Well, actually, in my book, I've got details about the level of crime back when I was born and what it is now. And I can't remember the exact figures, but it's gone up. Crime generally has gone up, I think, 500%. Violent crime by even more. And you have to ask what is driving this. And I think a large part of that is, as I said, I grew up in a world where everything got better, every kid got a job. But not only that, but in those days we spent time with each other. I mean, there was an hour's break for lunch at work, and you sat around with your mates, you chatted. And there was a coffee break, a tea break. And Friday or Saturday evening, you go to the pub with locals. I mean, what defined that post-war generation was not what we were buying and accumulating, but actually the time we spent with our friends and our family. And that's been, I think, dramatically undermined. And people aren't making those contacts. Also, too many people are being left behind. That fuels all that violence. But there is also the question of policing. When I became mayor in 2000, we had 25,000 police in London. I took it up to 35,000. But most important, created 630 neighbourhood patrols. So every one of London's 630 wards had 6 to 8 police whose job was just to patrol the streets, to walk around, get to know people. And that had a huge impact, and crime was going down. And of course, then Boris got in and cuts started to come, and then Cameron won the election and cuts got even worse. And I think nationally, we've now got 22,000 less police than we had back in 2010. And I just grew up in that Britain where there's always a copper coming around the street. So you knew if you do silly things, you'll get caught. But if you're living in a city where kids growing up never see a copper, they're going to think they can get away with stuff. And so I think good policing is absolutely crucial. But also it's a question of getting away from this idea we define ourselves by what we spend. Because also it's destroying our planet. I think what's striking these last few years is the increase in violent weather events is so much more rapid than the scientists were predicting. We've just seen 2 months of rainfall in just 2 days here in this country. Ghastly forest fires, floods all over. I think we are heading towards a mass extinction of ourselves and other species by the end of this century if we continue consuming and all the waste that's going out there. So we've got to change our lives and get back to what defined us, our relationship with our friends and our families and our neighbours, because that's what makes you happy. I mean, I've met some of the richest people in the planet. They're not particularly happy because there's always somebody else who's even richer than they are. I mean, I'm talking about Robert Maxwell and people like that. So literally, we need a generation of politicians to understand we're heading towards extinction. And if we don't dramatically change our economy and our way of life, most of your grandchildren are going to live to see that extinction.
And it's the grandchildren who are urging older generations to do something about this, right? Rana, please.
No, I feel like being redder than you, Ken, at this point. In the sense that I wonder, in some senses, can we use the word capitalism in London? Is that okay?
Okay,
I wonder what you think capitalism is for, because in your account of, so that there are poor people on the streets because of Thatcher and Blair, but there is something in what you say that implies that capitalism is supposed to provide a nice living for everybody and a sense of hope and futurity and all those sorts of things. I don't think that capitalism is for that at all, and I think that we are actually we are now going to experience what it was like in the 18th century. I totally agree with what you said at the beginning, that the Industrial Revolution was absolutely fundamental to producing modern Britain, because the Industrial Revolution made the entire economy dependent on labour. And labour, over the ensuing 150 years, clawed back from the system all kinds of astonishing concessions. I mean, there is nowhere in the history of the world can we imagine societies as rich and equal, unless we go possibly to 20,000 years ago, that as the West in the 1950s and 60s. But that is an extraordinary anomaly in the history of capitalism in general. If we look at the 18th century, the economy was run by financial elites, for financial elites, and the majority of the population was simply irrelevant and was far too fragmented to be able to bargain with these elites. Increasingly, we're entering another phase where the majority of the population is simply irrelevant to the economy. They're not required. And much of the thrust of Silicon Valley right now is to make those people feel even more irrelevant. To already, I imagine, if you drive a truck, you have the specter of your own irrelevance hanging over you daily. You are unwilling to ask for further concessions for your employers, because you know that your employers have embarked on the project of making all drivers superfluous. And we know that in the near future, accounting departments will have the same feeling. Young lawyers or lots of young architects, all kinds of jobs will be automated. So we're getting to a point where financial elites have removed themselves from their dependence on the majority of the population, and where the sort of situations you describe, where the majority of profits and surplus go to financial elites, plunges us back into the past. Therefore, I think that we find ourselves faced with wider questions than the questions of whether a left-wing or a right-wing government is in power. I think that even a left-wing government is powerless to introduce 98% income tax. The economy would shut down because international financial systems will just not sponsor an economy that has taxation at that level. And so a lot of the questions that we're talking about here are also about the nature of the economy itself. As you say, the bottom 50% of people in this country have not significantly benefited from all the economic growth that's happened in the last 40 years. But that is pretty much the case across the rich world, though there have been, if you look at the inequality line in the US, it didn't matter whether it was Obama or Clinton or Bush or Trump. It's been pretty much a straight line. So there are processes that we clearly have to investigate, which are outside of the purview of party politics in countries like this.
Well, I think there should be a dramatic increase in taxes on both the super rich and the giant corporations. And I just simply say this, well, if the financial sector then left London to go to another country, would that make our city worse? I mean, up until Thatcher deregulated the banking system in 1986, it was not predominant in London. And in the years since it has been, life has got worse for ordinary people. I mean, these financial institutions don't invest in Britain. The money's all laundered abroad, tax havens and all of that. I think you need to accept the fact that if we look to the future, seeing the financial sector move off somewhere else would not be a problem. What we need is a government that uses our tax system to create the jobs we really want, which is a big increase in care for the elderly, a big increase in care for our children. All our children from just a couple of years old should be going to really early preschool, getting involved in wider communities. We shouldn't, I trained as a teacher back in 1970. In those days, a great job. My wife's a teacher. She leaves at 6:15 in the morning. On a good day, she's home at 6 o'clock. On a bad day, at 7. She collapses on the settee. I feed her. And she goes to bed between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. She's absolutely knackered. Half her day is spent on paperwork. Literally, we must create the jobs that actually are good for other people and also give you a sense of community. I don't want to see a world in which robots are running an old person's home. I want people in there in much bigger numbers engaging with the elderly just as they should be engaging. I mean, class sizes are getting bigger and bigger. They should be getting smaller because we should be creating more teaching posts and all of that. And we are the 5th richest nation on the face of the planet. Even if the financial sector buggers off somewhere else, we've still got all the wealth we need to create a better society.
Okay. I think we are coming up to taking questions time, and let's do that. I'll take 2 or 3 questions together, so please raise your hands. Let's start with the lady in the 3rd row here. Please keep your questions brief and make it a question. Thanks.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I have a question for Ken and one for Rana. To Ken, I would like to say that as far as I'm aware, there are 6,250 individuals in the United Kingdom who fall into the category of ultra high net worth individuals having £20 million or more. Some of them, of course, are billionaires. Now, if we take the population of the UK to be 62.5 million, I know it's a bit more than that, but that figure divides nicely. You have one ultra-high net worth individual for each 10,000 people. If you ask them to give away £1 million a year, I think that would benefit the 10,000 people by about £100 each. So it seems to me rather naive to think that taxing the rich will suddenly make everybody else wealthy. And I think that's something to reflect upon. And to Rana, I would like to say that you pointed out quite rightly that we have an excess of people and not enough work, and that work is reducing. Why does nobody address the question of population? We don't need as many people as we have, and nobody really discusses this.
Thank you. Let's also...
Hi. Hello. It's a bit of a fanboy moment because I'm a huge fan of Rana. And I'd say that, your book is one of the books which resonated with a lot of Indians who love Delhi. So my question is about a restlessness in our spirit that you talk about. And in the 17 years that you've been there, do you think that is something that families in Delhi actually nurture? And that is what makes, that one of the greatest cities? Our restlessness, the restlessness in the spirit.
Okay, thank you. Was there another question here? I'll take 3 questions. No, okay, let's stop there.
Well,
Ken.
on the question of the redistributing tax, I mean, This government claims that only 20 billion pounds is caught up in tax avoidance and evasion. Most economists put it very much higher, and some say 120 billion. So it isn't just the super rich individuals, it's the giant corporations. Every time my kids are playing on their iPhones, they're paying for that. But the firms making that money aren't paying their fair share of tax back into the economy they're making the money from. So with this vast amount of wealth, we can afford, if we have a fair tax system, to pay for everything that we actually need. But anyone advocating this is going to be denounced and demeaned. I can't remember, what was the second question?
The population, why no one thinks about population.
Well, clearly, when nations are poor, women will have about 7 children each. Once you become rich, it slopes down to about 2 and is going down. You look at Japan, and Japan's population is starting to decline. So I think literally this is it was 2.5 billion people when I was born. Now it's coming up to 8 billion. It looks like we're on our way to 10. But I think it will go down, but we need to encourage it. The very first thing I did when I became a councillor back in 1971 was introduce free contraception in Lambeth. The Daily Mail said we were spreading disease and encouraging people to have more sex and so on, but we were just having an awful lot of girls getting pregnant because they couldn't afford to buy contraception. So we need to provide, contraception should be absolutely free to everybody. People should plan to have a family, not suddenly wake up and find they've got one by mistake.
Rana, do you want to respond to the restlessness question?
Just a little thing on the population question is that all countries which see a large number of people leaving the land in order to work in industry see a surplus, because industry usually does not grow quickly enough to absorb. The land is actually much better at supporting populations than we think it is. So from Europe, in the century following the Napoleonic Wars, 70 million people left to go to the New World. That's and because of the structure of European empire and stuff, there was that safety valve. Countries like India, China, etc., have to absorb that displaced population into their own systems. Currently, the Indian-Chinese economies are growing relatively quickly. It's still relatively disastrous in India. India needs to make 1 million new jobs every month to absorb those people who are either growing up or coming off the land, which it can't do by any means, and it's been a disaster under Modi. But economies such as those in sub-Saharan Africa, where that population is going into the cities with absolutely nothing to do, are generating these vast slums, which is why Mike Davis calls the slum the quintessential 21st century urban form. So I don't think it's just about the sheer number of people. Of course, there is a massive sheer number of people, but there is also an issue of organization, which we've never managed to get right over the last 2 centuries. The question about restlessness, there's so much to say, and there are many more things to say in this conversation in general, but just to say one thing. One thing I found very fascinating in the amazing conversations I had with people for this book, and it was based on about 150 different conversations with people from all ages, social classes, etc., was the extraordinary anti-Muslim, the Islamophobia of many of my Hindu interviewees, despite the fact, based on partition, but despite the fact that many of these people were born 30 or 40 years after partition, and that their grandparents who had experienced partition did not have those feelings. Many of the people who went through partition, who were fully psychologically formed at the time of partition, that is to say, people who were born in the 20s or 30s, had no feelings of prejudice towards Muslims. They'd grown up in a mixed society. They knew what partition was, they understood it, etc. It was their children and grandchildren who had not experienced it, but who grew up with the absences and the silences around Islam that were absolutely terrified by it. One of the people that I interviewed talked about the fact that when his family was given a plot of land in Delhi, his father told him that Delhi was a city of Muslim cemeteries, and that underneath the ground were all these Muslim corpses. And he, as a young child, walked around afraid of the ground because of these ghosts that came from this more powerful religion, this militant religion, this religion from Delhi's past. And he talked about how he had to consciously try not to pass on those kinds of, mute horror to his own children, because he had grown up terrified of Muslims. And so I think, like you see with the children and grandchildren of people who experienced the Holocaust, you see in I'm talking now, of course, about Hindu families on the India side of the border. You see that kind of restlessness very much reproduced from generation to generation. And there are a lot of the people that I interviewed, the businessmen particularly, had extraordinary addictions, extraordinary levels of addiction. Alcohol, drugs, wife beating. It was a very, very pathological group of people that were, on the face of it, in the public eye, extremely successful, very, very wealthy, brilliant at what they did, an extraordinary business imagination, but their private lives were restless is one word, yes.
More questions? Yeah, there's one here in the front.
Can we hear the voice of Mukulika? A question for you, as somebody who knows Delhi. I don't know whether you were born there or
Lived there a long time.
Okay. As somebody who goes to Delhi far more than is good for my health, and I mean that in a very literal way as well as psychologically, we're told that Delhi is scarred by partition, but partition, of course, happened to many people in many ways. It happened in Punjab, it happened in Bengal. And I wonder whether, insofar as Delhi has a character which is very defined by partition and its scars, whether you find similar scars in Jalandhar or Amritsar or other places, and then also the people who migrated to Pakistan, who might have seen violence, whether we see the same patterns there. And of course, Karachi and Calcutta are unhappy cities in their own way. Maybe people would say in Karachi after the MQM came to power, and Bengal after the 60s. So I don't know whether, how much can we say that the scars that Delhi bears, insofar as we can say they are scars, are down to partition, or whether there's something else happening?
Okay, thank you. Are there any other?
To you primarily, if I may.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll do my best. Yeah. You have another question?
Yes, I do. The quality of air one reads about in Delhi is amongst the 10 worst cities. All of this, economic growth and everything. What do all these people that invest and have plans have for children running around with masks and stuff like that? I mean, Beijing has really cleaned up by electric vehicles and then all those things. What is Delhi doing?
Thank you. And did you have a question there? Yeah, we'll take that, and I think that'll be the final one.
It's actually very similar to this question, which was a question for both of you. Since Ken, you touched upon the environmental cost of cities and the unsustainable growth and the cost to the planet. What do both of you have in your mind in, for example, 10 or 20 years' time as a sustainable Delhi and a sustainable London? Is there such a thing? And what would it look like?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to let the panelists respond, and if you have time, we have another 5 minutes, I can see. Let me quickly respond to your question. briefly to say that yesterday we were talking about cricket at exactly this time, 24 hours ago. Today it's being played. I have no idea what's happening in the match. If anyone can fill me in, I'll be delighted. Is it raining in Manchester? Yeah. So we're not missing anything. So the experience of India in Pakistan, the memories of partition, they shaped this Indo-Pak relationship, and we talked a lot about that. The one response I can make immediately to what you said is that Calcutta as a city, unlike Delhi, has had a very long partition. It wasn't something that happened in 47. It's happened, Bengal was partitioned at the beginning of the 20th century, then in 47, then in 71. There's been a constant flow of people, Bengalis, back into Calcutta. And that has shaped the politics of Kolkata. And now, people who are flabbergasted that a political party like the BJP, with its very divisive Hindutva ideology, is taking root in Bengal, should not be surprised, because, in fact, a lot of that, the left bastion of West Bengal politics was built on precisely that insecurity of Hindu identity, of Islamophobia, which under the guise of communism, communists had a very good anti-communal record, but the experience of being migrants away from a Muslim nation has festered and been absolutely germane to the growth of politics in that. So it's not just Delhi, but I think Delhi has, there are particular ways in which it manifests itself in Delhi that are peculiar to Delhi, but by no means are unique. Of course, I mean, all cities have their own histories, which is kind of the point of, you can talk about cities in a comparative perspective. But Delhi's history, I mean, William is in the audience, the history of Delhi, the 7 incarnations of Delhi that it has is a very particular history. So stories of Muslims being buried under the ground have a resonance because it is there in the physical landscape of that city. So people have something to relate to. But let me allow Rana to respond first and then perhaps Ken to end. You have about a minute and a half each.
And I think also that cities and cultures have different ways, different capacities for dealing with certain kinds of trauma. And Delhi, let's face it, was not really a city in 1947 when all these people arrived. I mean, the population was less than 1 million on the eve of a partition, and about 1 million people arrived. I think quickly about this issue of pollution, I don't really know what to say to you in the sense that I'm quite pessimistic. The energy burst, to go back again to the Industrial Revolution, the energy burst that was supplied by coal and that propelled the modern economy is still the way that we define every kind of progress. Any definition we have of increase in standard of living, development, etc., requires greater extraction of energy sources. Unless something descends from the heavens to change that equation, the raising of 2.5 billion people in 2 neighboring countries, the raising of those people's standards of living will necessarily have a massive impact on the economy, on the environment, especially with the rapidity and intensity that's going on right now. I can't imagine, there might be quick fixes to secure the population of Delhi or whatever, but I think that the overall impact of this will be very severe. And it's tragic because there's no real way to rethink it unless, as I say, something else changes.
Well, it's really simple to solve the problem. I have I've worked all my life in central London. I have the lung capacity of a man 5 years older. Everyone in my family has died of heart attack or stroke. I'm almost certainly going to die of lung disease because we have all these polluting cars still out there on the streets. Just before I lost the election to Boris, I'd introduced controls on heavy goods vehicles to stop their pollution. Had I not lost, we're going to start the first stage of doing that to cars. By the end of that 4 years, we would have got most polluting vehicles off the streets with very heavy daily charges. And unfortunately, Sadiq Khan has just introduced the first stage of a new one. It's going to extend to the North and South Circular next year, so we can solve that. We can also tackle all our environmental problems. You've just got to get behind green energy. All our roofs should have solar panels and photovoltaic cells. Our houses should all be properly insulated. We are terribly wasteful. But also, in tackling that problem, you create hundreds of thousands of good jobs as people actually install all of this stuff. And then just finally about the legacy of the partition. If you look at our history, in the Churchill wartime government, they sent Sir Stafford Cripps, one of the leading Labour MPs, to India to try and talk the political leaders into accepting an independent India that included what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh and India, not to divide it along religious lines, because they feared it would lead to wars and conflict. Well, it has 3 wars. Now we've got Pakistan and India accumulating nuclear arsenals and so on. Exactly the same happened in Palestine by dividing it into Arab and Jewish areas. I think we should have a complete separation between religion and the nation, state and government. People should be free to practice whatever religion they want, but once you start building into your government, you do terrible things. Under Queen Elizabeth I, once we'd gone Protestant, we sent troops over to Ireland and we killed 1/3 of all the Irish Catholics. And politicians exploit these fears. The Daily Mail headline, 100 years ago, Jews bring crime and disease to Britain. I grew up in London where you were told, don't touch a black person, they're dirty. Then it was the Irish Catholics during the IRA bombing campaign who were demonised and abused. Now it's Muslims and East Europeans. Politicians and newspapers, they exploit this. What I've discovered in my lifetime, we're all just human. As a 21-year-old, I spent 6 months trekking through North Africa and West Africa. The people there were just the same as the people at home, irrespective of colour or faith. We're all human. We should just start listening to each other.
Thank you. And can I just say, I think we owe you collective thanks for the congestion charge as well. Thank you.